Right, well, here we are with another episode 43 of Retropower Uncut. 43, that's quite a few. And I'm stood in front of Utah, so it seems a good place to start. James is just working at the moment on the door cards for Utah. We've made those in plastic, which is a type of plastic I've already forgotten. I think it's ABS, but I can't actually remember. The issue we have with those is that the clips that retain the door cards onto the door need to be recessed slightly into the surface of the plastic to prevent them making a visible bump in the finished leather. So he's actually just going through routering out. He's marked out where all the clips go by templating all the doors, doing each door individually because mirroring things doesn't work because things weren't that mirrorable back then. And he's now routering out all the clips in a little recess for each clip in the correct orientation so that it's the correct way around when it's all installed in the door. It's quite a painstaking job actually. It's quite fiddly. So he's currently going through that. And it's a very interesting point. It's one of the areas where we each time we do this sort of job, we always think it would be really handy again, going back to the old scanner game, it'd be really, really handy if we had a scanner and a CNC router, which is something we're hopefully getting fairly soon, because it would speed this sort of job up immensely, being able to just pick up all the hole centers, work out all the clipper orientations, draw the CAD for the recesses, and then we could just machine all this automatically. It would be quite a big time saving. So that's something we'll be bearing in mind for the future. But yeah, there are a few other jobs have gone on this. There's a bit more work been done on the doors. Trev's been working getting the bonnet release cable threaded through, which is a bit of a tortuous route, but that's gone through now. So that's all coming together. There are a few little bits we're waiting for, but yeah, progress will be carrying on. I'm trying to remember what I've forgotten. I'm bound to have forgotten something on there. Yes, centre console. I knew I'd forgotten something significant. The other thing that James has been working on this was the centre console. You may remember there was an aluminium profiled section that we had water jet cut, which will eventually be, or fairly soon now, be wood grain effect hydro dipped, which will be the main centre console in the car. We've been struggling a little bit with getting that machined correctly. The processes we've gone through a variety of ways of making it, and there wasn't a particularly nice way of making it. We've eventually managed to get it machined to our satisfaction after having gone around the house a little bit. That's now been done, which has then enabled the real peril level, because the machining is not a particularly cheap operation and quite fiddly to do. And it had to be done before it was curved. Well, that panel's now been curved. That's been formed on a little press attachment I've made to do a downwards V block basically on the hydraulic press. And James has shaped that to the requisite angle on there with suitable protection on it, so it doesn't put any marking or no significant marking on the surface of the aluminium. So that's now ready for a bit of primer build, so that we can take out any marks in the surface of it, prep. Then that can be painted, and then that can go for hydro dipping. So it's been a bit of a chain of events there that we were stopped at near the beginning of that chain of events. There's still a lot more events to come after that's been hydro dipped as well, for various reasons that I'm not going to explain now. But that chain of events has been held up a little bit by the machining. That's now done, thanks to Gary at Dynamic Precision, who pulled the magic on getting that sorted. So yeah, we can now move forward with all of that. So that's where we're at with Utah. Quickly touch on the Manta. That's basically been exhaust fabrication. James has been carrying on with exhaust fabrication on that. He's nearly there. We've had to stop doing that for a couple of reasons today, but he's very, very nearly there. He's just at the final bit. Basically, the pipe that goes into the back box on the Manta. He's just got to finish that. There's going to be a couple of segment bends that need TIG welding up onto between the over axle section and the into the rear box section. It's literally about a 6-inch long section that's got to be done, but it's an S bend, and he's just got to finish that off. He was just finishing off the mountings for that this morning, but the priorities got juggled a little bit, with such as is the case with these things. So he's had to just drop that for a bit to get these door cards sorted out, so that they can get put in the pipeline for trim. So that's where we're at on that, and then. Where I'm looking at a Golf at the moment was where the Stratos was. Now, the Stratos are at the end of last week. This was Friday. Everybody vacated and went to Retro Rides Weekender at Goodwood on Friday morning. On Thursday, the Stratos was taken around the yard for a final little run-up just to check that nothing significant was going to come off it and nothing significant was wrong, so that it could go down to Northampton Motorsport and have quite a bit of work done there. I would say go on the rolling road. It's not just as simple as go on the rolling road. There's a lot of electronics on that car. It's basically all run by a PDU and an ECU. And so there's a lot of programming to be done. Only a small proportion of that programming was currently done. Some of that's being done by Northampton Motorsport because it ties into a lot of functions of the car that are best tested on a rolling road. So they've been, so Chris and Troy at Northampton Motorsport, highly recommended, they've been working on that. And doing various other things, and there's a lot of unknowns to us on that car. I should again hasten to add, it's not a case of put it on the rollers, see what power it made, nothing like that at all. There's a lot of unknowns. The Supercharger installation has a number of aspects that we're a little bit new to. I think anybody who is a realist, who isn't a production car manufacturer, would say they would be new to. The charge cooling on that car depends on two small radiators in the side pods with an air vent in the sides. There's a little bit of difficulty feeding air to that well enough on the dyno, on the rollers, as well as feeding air to the front of the car for the main radiator and getting heat away and exhaust fumes away from the back of the car. So Troy's had his work cut out there, but all good so far. I'm not going to unveil any results on that just yet, but all looking good. There's a few questions. We can have a little head scratch on the charge cooling because replicating road conditions on the rollers is very difficult. So we're not quite sure what charge temps we can achieve. Also, the rolling road cell was extremely hot when that was actually being run yesterday, and I believe they were around 36 degrees in the rolling road cell. So the charge cooling wasn't really being given a fair crack of the whip. I believe, from what the information I've got, we were seeing about 14 degrees above ambient on the charge cooling, which is actually very good. The trouble was the ambient's at 36 degrees, so we were seeing charge temps of 50 degrees C, which is higher than I'd like. That said, I'd be happy probably at 40, so we're not going to make huge differences. But I'd like to finalise all that and know exactly where we sit with all that before I come out with it, before I unveil a power figure. So I'm going to leave the unveiling of that to Cal next week, when we actually know exactly where we're at with charge temperatures and conversation factors and that sort of thing. But put it this way, it's certainly enough. It's certainly going to be enough to be very scary in that car. We don't need to. I don't need to elaborate on that. It's definitely going to be pretty frightening because the torque curve from that supercharged engine is pretty serious. It's a pretty fat torque curve, and it's that makes the car quick, not the peak number. That's a thing that people need to get their heads around. Is that the reason for supercharging that car, not turbocharging or anything like that, is to basically just give that big engine feel without putting a massive V8 in it, and effectively that's what it is. It's now a massive V8. In the meantime, we're going to wander on next door to a very noisy area. Hopefully not too noisy, but Tom's been beating the hell out of quite a lot of pieces of metal, so you'll be able to probably see some of that going on, I would imagine. Yeah, lots of percussive adjustments. Oh, and some wheeling adjustment right now as well, as we go through. We've got the fabrication den in full force. We've got Scott TIG welding. He's making some bits I'll explain in a minute, and Tom's busy on the wheel now doing some bits which I'll also explain in a minute. I'll let Jamie go through here. and we'll pause by the Land Cruiser. Scott's been busy and Stu's been busy for a little bit on this. We've modified the bulkheads. Scott's made a section for the bulkhead because we want to fit a much larger than standard heating, ventilation, air conditioning, HVAC system to the car. We're going to use the original air intake that came through the wing and through the bulkhead. I think Carl might have mentioned that before. Can't remember. We're going to use that as the intake. We're going to fit, basically we tend to use the vintage air units for HVAC. There are pros and cons to using them. Sometimes the packages are a little bit clunky to fit into cars that aren't great big American cars because they're designed for the US market. But that said, they're very good for control. They use nice modern controls on, or relatively modern controls on them, and as a package for the money and for what they achieve, they're very hard to beat, so that's why we use them. In this, we're going to remote the fan. In fact, we did this on the Jensen slightly. I remoted the fan on the unit in the Jensen slightly. On this, we're going to remote the fan a bit further and basically fit the fan to the original air intake box, or at least either a reconditioned one or we'll build one. But basically where the original air intake box was there, which had a nice water drain system so that if you're driving through deep water splashes, you don't put water into your heating ventilation system. So we're going to keep that system there, mount the fan in the engine bay and draw the air through there and blow it through there, obviously sealed from the engine bay but mounted in it. And then we'll either 3D print or probably fabricate a duct that then goes from the aperture in the bulkhead through and into the HVAC unit. Now we wanted to use a full climate control system from Vintage Air. It's actually the same unit that we used on the Jensen. In order to do that, we needed to make quite a lot of clearance in the bulkhead. Now, there's no need for the recess in the bulkhead now because the engine's a lot shorter and we've mounted it towards the front position of the original engine options in these so that we've got a reasonable rear prop length with the new gearbox. It means that we can put basically a flat bulkhead in. We didn't want to do it flat, and there are a few little profile sections on this side, one of which is a dimple at the end of that line, where cutting them out would have basically necessitated making a whole new bulkhead really to make it look tidy. And we wanted to put some sort of swaging in there anyway to reinforce the bulkhead. So the easy option was, and the sensible option was, to utilise a bit of a swage that was already there and basically extend it across. And when Scott's made the new panel, we've got a Pullmax tool that was very, very close to the shape of that original swage. So he's used that, swaged it across, got all that tigged in and flushed in. There's a little bit more panel beating to do once the engine's out, but he's basically got all that sorted, done a lovely job of that. In the meantime, while he was doing that, Stu's been underneath the car and has, I think we mentioned the engine mounts before, Stu's now made the transmission cross member, got all that in, got everything centralised and in the right. I say centralised, the engine actually sits slightly off centre. Transmission sit basically to keep the balance of the whole unit given the offset of the transfer box. The whole thing actually sits very slightly offset. That's all now set correctly. Transmission cross members all made. Stu's fabricated that, so that's all in. So everything's now mounted. Obviously it'll be on new mounts, it'll all be rebuilt, but it is sat in there and mounted now. Scott's then been working under the dash, cleared out the metalwork we don't need under the glove box and a couple of reinforcers under the dash that aren't really necessary now. Removed all that lot, and he's now working on the installation of the Vintage Air HVAC, it's climate control unit, mounting under the dash so that we haven't got it hanging down under the dash. We've seen a few instances with mounting more modern HVAC units in these where it kind of hangs down under the dash and doesn't look too great inside the vehicle, and we want to try and keep it all looking really clean and simple and nice, so we don't really want that. So we've done some work so that we can get that tucked right up under the scuttle so that it's out of the way and all looks nice and clean and tidy. So that's what Scott's on with at the moment on that. And then I think moving on from that, we go on to Jensen. Basically on this, Tom's been working on that bit. We mentioned before, we're making the modified rear end, we're doing in steel. It's difficult. It won't be steel in the end. It will be either fiberglass or carbon fibre, probably carbon fibre. There's various decisions to be made on that. Almost certainly carbon fibre though. The problem is that to do that in composite at this stage, effectively we're making a book here. And to do that in composite at this stage would mean laying up quite a lot of underhung composite onto a book in turn, which doesn't exist. Two problems: we've got to make the book out of something which has got to be supported and stay in place against gravity, and then we've got to lay up against gravity, which would mean vacuum bagging it all, both of which are pretty challenging processes to do underneath the back of that car. So we decided that we'd put a steel insert in around the boot floor where we've cut the back of the body off, which will then bolt to the bolts that also mount the body to the back of the boot floor, so that everything stays aligned. And then we're going to make the rear valance, the new rear valance, or the new lower section of the rear body, the buck, if you like, in steel, and then we can then work out all the blends, do any filler work and everything else to basically make that a section of the buck. And then the molds can be taken from that as well. It'll probably have filler over it. It won't be a steel final surface, but basically we're using that to create the shape as the buck to then take the molds from. So Tom's been working on that, which involves just a lot of battering metal, a lot of shrinking, a lot of wheeling, and he's getting there now. He's doing a grand job. He's made a little wireframe pattern, which I think might have been on the last video. Again, I'm not quite up to speed on things because I've had a lot going on. But he's made a little wireframe jig, if you like, to test a temporary buck, I suppose you'd call it, just to test the fit of the panels and to make sure we've got symmetry from side to side. So he's done all that, and he's now getting well on with the shaping. He's done one corner, he's done the centre section roughed out. He's now roughing out the other corner. Then he's got to rough out the cutout in the centre of the centre section, clamp everything up again, get the overlap, scribe out all the cuts, make all the cuts, and then TIG weld it all together. So yeah, that's progressing very nicely. My phone is ringing and I'm just going to turn that off temporarily. I will wander on this way and go round to the Morris, which Stu is now working on. Stu's had a few jobs on here. The rear lights, he just before the car went, yes, I'll get things in the right order. The car we mentioned before had been to Simpson Exhaust. It's now back from Simpson Exhaust. That's the key, it's back here. Matt and his guys have done an absolutely lovely job of doing the bodywork on that. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. I'm going to turn that off. Yeah, they've done an absolutely superb job of the exhaust system, as they always do. The welding's pretty much faultless. It's absolutely a lovely job. They've done all that, absolutely superb. Got the car back here now, so the next phases are that Stu's working on getting the rear lights fitted, which he's basically done. A number of other little tasks on the car, and the other thing he's literally currently working on is the bonnet hinges. You might recall we made some in steel before, some sort of prototype test ones in steel before. They did work, however, with the couple of changes we've made on the front end, they now don't work. Basically the lights get in the way, so he's modified the bonnet hinges and he's now done a parallelogram linkage bonnet hinge, which just shunts the bonnet forward a little bit to get some more clearance there. So that's now done. The mock-up ones are now done. I think he's just trialling those parts, or he's just about to trial those. Probably tomorrow he's going to be trial fitting those, making sure they all work. If they do, we'll cut them in the actual final material and use those, and that'll be the bonnet fit sorted out. There's various other things. There's a little bit of work to do, finish off on the wings, and we're modifying the doors as well, incorporating the side sill section into the bottom of the door. So he's got to do that as well. Though watch this space. But yeah, Stu's back on with the Morris now. So all those the Morris watchers looking for content, that'll be coming along now. It was only there was only no Morris last week because it was down at Simpson Race Exhaust. So. Yes, Porsche 356 lights. Jamie's just pointed out. I can't remember what I have and haven't said. Yeah, they're Porsche 356 rear lights, which amazingly, Stu says literally fit perfectly on those wings. Given that those wings were basically just roughed out in foam. Again, those who've seen all the videos would realise we roughed them out in foam on one side just to get what was a pleasing shape, and then Stu took profiles off that and then made the wings to that shape. They're literally a perfect fit on the curvature of the wing, so that was a lucky bonus. And then finally, I'm going to point at the paint booth, even though there's no point really pointing at it because the lights aren't on in there. But the Chevette progress, Gaz and Steve have been working on the Chevette, and that's now. Previously, I think it was in its epoxy high build primer where we left off last time. That's now had the undercoating of U-Pole Raptor applied. That's black U-Pole Raptor underneath, which is what we do on basically all the vehicles. That's now on, and then we lacquer that as well. Seems a bit overkill under a car. However, and yes, it probably is. The big plus of it, it's easy to wash. For the sake of not an awful lot of pounds worth of lacquer. It just makes it look a bit nicer in the short term, but it means that when you jet wash the underside of the car, the dirt just washes straight off. It's much easier to keep clean, and it's a bit of extra protection as well. Not that it really needs it. With the zinc metal spray and the U-Pole Raptor under there, it really doesn't need a lot else anyway. But with the lacquer as well, it just makes it, keeps it looking a bit nicer, makes it look a bit shinier, and it's easier to wash. So he's done that. He's then raptored the any internal cavities that needed in, which is basically chiefly the inside of the rear quarter panels. That gives us an amount of sound deadening without putting sound deadening in there, seals up any small little seams and things that are very high. Sometimes it's hard to seam seal. The seams in the wheel arches, for example, are sealed from the underneath of the car anyway, so there's not really much point sealing them from inside the car, but if you raptor inside the quarter panels, that seals them anyway, so that does quite a neat job of that anyway. So he's wrapped it inside the quarter panels. Obviously, there's masking and unmasking going on all this. There's masking up to do the Raptor underneath, and there's demasking. Then there's remasking to do the Raptor inside the quarter panels. Then there's demasking. Then there's remasking again to do the final paint on the inside of the car, which is now done. And that's done in the final. I can't remember which black it is. It's black, but I can't remember exactly what black. I'm not very good on colours, but basically the final paint is now done on the inside of the shell. So the next step now is we've got a sealing coat on, as far as is practicable and possible. We've got a sealing coat on all of the outer face, outer bodywork. Actually, Gaz, thinking about presumably engine bay next, are we?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm just check with Gaz, because I was about to say we're ready for wet flatting the outside of the car, but we're not actually. He's going to paint the engine bay next, because the engine bay is all prepped. We won't be wet flatting that. There's no point wet flatting that. That will be dry flatted. Then paint the engine bay. Once the engine bay is painted, yes, any areas of potential bare metal that only has primer on, or any seams or anything else that could get water into, are then sealed as much as is possibly practicable. We'll then wet flat the outside of the car, and then that'll be the final paint on the outside of the car. Prior to that, and I think we'd have covered it last week, obviously at the primer stage, I had a final mock-up of all the panels, which is pretty laborious and pretty time-consuming, but basically put them all back on again. Final check that everything fits because the next time they all go together, they'll all be in paint and it's too late. So that's where we're at with that. So yeah, the next stage, there'll certainly be more paint on it. Whether it's fully painted next week, I don't know. Probably, but we'll see. Watch this space and you'll see. So there you go. Like and subscribe again. And yeah, I shall see you all very soon.